Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to our weekly question and answer session. We have a bunch of questions, a bunch of good questions. Some of them I think might have fairly quick answers. Others, well, we'll see. But we'll get right into it. What is a good way of preparing oneself for death? What practices should one undertake? I guess the question here is kind of concerned with that moment of death, right? I mean, any question where you ask me, what is a good practice? What practices should one undertake? I'm going to always answer, well, mindfulness, of course. So preparing for oneself for death is really no different. But, perhaps you're concerned that there is something special about death. And so what do you do to prepare yourself for something very specific? Or are there any nuances that you should be concerned with? Hey, are you here to stay with us? Okay. You look very familiar. Okay. Welcome. But death is... this is the important thing in Buddhism to understand about death. Death is only another moment in time. Yes, there are some very specific things that happen that are different from things that happen during life. But they're still just things that happen. And the important part of this very vague things that happen is the reactions to those things that happen. Whatever happens during death, mindfulness is still going to be the most important. That being said, life isn't just meditation. And so while it's still true that the most important thing in my mind is going to be mindfulness, there are intellectual sorts of exercises that help put you in the right frame of mind, like reflecting on death. Remembering that you're going to die all the time, do that daily, the Buddha said. You should be always aware of the fact that we're going to die. Otherwise, you'll be caught off guard and you're much more likely to be unmindful. What do I do? What do I do? It's happening. Because you weren't familiar or ready for it, right? Other things you can do is do lots of good things in this life, so you won't be afraid of death. What might happen to me? Well, you're not afraid of that because you know you're a good person. You know you've developed good things. But the best thing is still mindfulness. Oh, another thing about that is the Mahasi Sayadaw wrote a commentary on the Pura Bheda Sutta. So I recommend reading that if you're interested. It's the English is not great, but still worth reading in my mind. This is not working anymore. Again. Oh, okay, maybe it is. Can formal meditation be done while not sitting, lying, or standing still? Could brushing teeth be a formal practice? It's kind of where the line between formal and informal becomes blurred. I think it's a good question, really. And in fact, I think it's good to think of those things like that. Eating You can consider the act of eating to be a formal meditation practice where you particularly have a format to it. Being said, probably not worth it, I would say, to have like a format. I'm going to eat each bite exactly the same. Probably more valuable for you to observe how you eat normally and try and be mindful of the different movements. So the difference between formal and informal is generally like, do you have a format? Is it going to be formulaic or not? Eating need not be formulaic. Of course, the mindfulness, thinking of it as a formal practice, is in the sense of, yes, this eating will be an eating meditation. I will be mindful of everything, but it doesn't mean you have to scoop, raise, bite, scoop, raise, bite, like as though it were a formal walking meditation. So I think that's the difference. Brushing the teeth as well. Yeah, maybe you do have a formula for brushing your teeth. Again, blurring the lines, but most important is that anything can be a practice of mindfulness throughout the day. So our instructor course, do we officially authorize lay people to teach? Do we personally place value on the idea of a lineage of authorized teachers? So the answers to your questions, no, no, no. No, I don't believe in authorizing people to teach. I don't believe in a lineage of authorized teachers. My teacher didn't either. And I've seen groups that do, that are very big on handing out certificates. I don't have a certificate. But I did spend a year sitting at my teacher's feet. And I think I got quite knowledgeable about his meditation practice. I mean, he's told other people after doing the foundation course or maybe the advanced course that they should go and teach people. Yeah, spread the teaching. It's good. However you learn to teach others in that way. It's important. I mean, when you authorize people, wow, ego becomes a real issue. As soon as someone thinks of themselves as a teacher, lots and lots of problems there. So difficult to discern rising and falling. Breath gets too shallow. I mean, the breath is never too shallow to note. You can just note rise, fall, rise, fall. But it's also a matter of focus. It takes some time if you've never looked at the stomach, the abdomen, it takes some time to get your body and your mind in a position where it can be a valuable or viable meditation object. When you feel quiet, calm, alert and bright, as you say, equanimous, all of that can be noted, and that's what the recommendation I would give. When it feels like noting is unneeded, it depends what you mean by unneeded. Unneeded to make you stay calm? No. Unneeded to gain needed to gain insight? Yes. Needed to gain. It's unneeded to stay calm? Yes, that's true. Unneeded to gain insight? No. Needed to gain insight. So being calm and gaining insight are two very different things. Just because you're sitting there equanimous, it's really of no value unless you're gaining insight, which comes from objectivity, and you need to be objective about your equanimity, for example. Saying to yourself, calm, calm, or neutral, neutral, feeling, and so on. That's a common problem. People feel like the noting is just stopped. There's nothing to note. No, you should note all those things that you're talking about, because it sounds like there's actually a lot going on. If you like it, you would note liking. But I do recommend, if you can, to try and find the stomach. It's a very good general object of meditation. If we are reborn based on the karma, how can animals be reborn as people if they kill to live? Yeah, I mean, the answer, as you may suspect, is that they have a very hard time doing so. This isn't a fair game where there's somebody saying, oh, I know you have to eat to live, so you have to kill to live, so that's okay, you can still become human. No, it's like there's no God. This is not a fair game. If you're in that position, I mean, it's reality. If you're killing, you're not going to cultivate good karma. It's just the way of it. So the path for a carnivore to become human is very dismal, very difficult. Of course, they got themselves in that position. It's all very fair, actually. How you get to the position of being a carnivore, they got to talk about that as well. When you're thinking and you're drawn into it, and then you aren't of course able to note when you're thinking because you're lost in thought. Once you come back, note that you were thinking by saying thinking. Mindfulness or sati is just remembering that it is what it is, reminding yourself. So what happens after you come back is maybe you react to it saying, oh, I was thinking a lot, or maybe you continue on with the thinking, or however. We're just replacing that with a reminder. It was only thinking. So it's always going to be technically after the fact. That's not a problem. Mindfulness is about reminding yourself. So just say to yourself, thinking. Or even just knowing when you have this consciousness, I was thinking, you can say knowing, and focus on that thought. Modern science tells us that insufficient sleep can lead to increases in risk for serious health conditions, including Alzheimer's. And traditional Buddhist advice seems to encourage sleep deprivation. What's the sensible thing to do? The sensible thing to do is to sleep as much as is healthy, is best for you, which is really just not saying anything, I suppose, but it's important because the answer there is that an intensive Buddhist meditator is nothing like the people in those studies that tell you that it leads to Alzheimer's and etc., etc. Those people are people who need very little sleep, if any. They're in a position where their mind is perfect and body are perfectly capable of regenerating themselves without any sleep. Sounds tough or even impossible. It's very tough to get to that position. Now we try during our courses to get people to very refined states. But it would only be in such a refined state that you would ever think it useful, valuable, proper to go without sleep. I think that's a valid answer. I would like to see a intensive meditator be tested for some of those problems, and I think the results might be revelatory. When we walk during the day, is it best to try and walk slowly, or should you just keep to ordinary movements? I mean, you just have to be mindful, so the technical aspects are not the most important thing, but practically speaking, yeah, I think it would be best just to say left, right, left, or right, left, rather than actually trying to break it down. It becomes... It's not wrong if you were to go very slowly, if you were trying to make everything into mindfulness. There's something, especially for new meditators, but just in general, there's something useful about trying to be mindful during natural movements, during the movements that are familiar to us. So it's actually potentially a good thing to move at normal speed, instead of trying to say, okay, I have to go to the washroom, lifting, placing, or so on. It's actually in some ways more beneficial to make it a natural movement, because it helps you be mindful in what's familiar to you. It helps you learn about the way your mind works. But either way, there are different styles, and I think both are valid. And depending on the individual, really, one might be more valuable than the other. But I don't think either is really the most important thing to concern yourself with. According to brain scans, this is always a problem thing to say, because it's always very vague and general. When you say, according to brain scans, X, Y, Z, to convince me, you have to be very specific. And this kind of statement is made about things that have certainly never, ever been verified through brain scans. It's often used in proper ways, to say things, but this statement is problematic. You say, according to brain scans, there is an area of the brain in charge of consciousness. That statement is just loaded with problems. According to brain scans, which, by the way, require filtering out a whole bunch of data and can have useful results, but often say far less than people make them out to be saying. There's an area of the brain, yes, it's clear that there are areas of the brain, and they clearly perform different, they activate at different times, in different situations, and they have different causes and different effects. Definitely areas of the brain. In charge of consciousness. In charge of consciousness. Which would mean the brain controlled consciousness. I mean, it sounds like something you might hear a scientist say. There's a problem with it, though. I mean, there are studies that say all sorts of different things, and there's some interesting studies about times when the brain is completely inactive, with no measurable brain activity in any of the areas you're talking about, in any of the areas whatsoever, and yet consciousness is still verified. Near-death experience is a common one. But then your question, actually, I don't quite understand, but I assume you're trying to ask, something about, isn't consciousness just the brain? Isn't the mind just the brain? And I've answered this many times, of course, in different ways and at different lengths, but simply I would say that what I've said many times is that the brain doesn't even exist. Brain is just something that we observe. If you affect the brain, mind is affected, absolutely. Mind and brain appear to be intertwined, but what you're actually talking about is not quite clear, because brain is just, it's matter, which we still don't actually know everything there is to know about. I mean, we know that there are things like cells and molecules and atoms and subatomic particles, but we're still not entirely clear about what any of this is. And we're very generally ignorant of the context within which the physical realm is situated, which is in experience. Like, you have to actually experience all of this in order to even make observations, in order to say there is the physical realm whatsoever. You need consciousness. So to say that the brain creates consciousness is really putting the cart before the horse. You require consciousness to even make those observations, to even have a concept of the physical realm. Right? All of these observations that we make we could be being tricked. We could be in a simulation, and there are scientists checking to see, oh, what if we do it like this, and what if we do it like that? We don't really have any valid way of verifying anything. All we can verify is that there is consciousness, so it actually comes first. It's more complicated. I mean, generally I would say forget about such questions and work on what's in your best benefit. Learn about what's in your benefit. What's to your benefit? Your best interest. Regarding boredom, I don't know how to manage this. Be mindful. You know it to be a wrong state. It's not helpful. If if and when you actually know something to be a wrong state, like actually know, it won't happen. That's how the mind works. The mind engages in reactions like boredom because it's under the impression that there's some benefit to it. Through observation and coming to see that there is no benefit to things like boredom, the mind gives them up. Just use mindfulness. Here's an interesting question. Done some other meditations, believe in God, but finding benefit in our meditation and different meditations. But still afraid that when you die, you might have been on the wrong path. So again, I'm not 100% clear your actual intent in asking this, but I get kind of a general gist. And I know I have thoughts about these sorts of things, like how unfortunate it is that religions play the fear card and say, believe this because if you don't, you'll go to hell. But the problem is there are lots and lots of religions saying that about different things that you should believe. And so, in fact, if you're really going to be afraid, then you're really going to be afraid, well, then you're in big trouble. Because you got to be really afraid of all these different ones. It's basically, if that is your outlook, find the right path for when you die, then you're in big trouble, because it's like playing roulette. It's like having a chamber full of bullets when you're playing Russian roulette. Only one of them, is empty. That's how it seems. In fact, I would say that none of the chambers are empty. They're all just going to get you killed in the end. So Buddhism's take on all this is learn the truth. Don't rely on belief. I believe in God is a meaningless statement. I believe in God really has no value to it. We put so much value on this. I believe in... so this mind state arises of belief. People believe in all sorts of crazy things. Much more valuable is I know. I have evidence for. I have observed. These sorts of things have value. And of course there should be hierarchical, more experience, more knowledge, more clarity, more first-hand knowledge. This is all better. So you read about something in a book, that's one kind of knowledge. You know what the book says. You see it for yourself, that's a very different kind of knowledge. And much more recommended. So, I mean, there's not really much to go in there. Recommend meditating and you will find the truth for yourself. Then you don't need to believe or worry about anything, because it's like, I know what death is. I understand the mind. I've worked it all out. Death doesn't scare me. That kind of thing. How do we help people if they don't want your help? At least to explain to them that yes, there is a way to cease suffering. I suppose a better question is, why help people if they don't want your help? I mean, there's an answer there. I think the answer is that you want to help them. Wanting things is a cause of suffering. wanting to help people, no less. Another question we might ask is, how do we help people if they do want your help? Let's answer that one first. I think a very basic answer is, it's very difficult. You might even answer, you can't. We're talking about people that want your help, right? People want your help. How do you help them? You can't. You can, but it has to be qualified. You can help them learn how to help themselves. Can you do that with someone who doesn't want to be helped? I suppose, potentially, you could convince them. I think the worst problem with it is not convincing them. The worst problem is that if they didn't have the honest, genuine interest in it, you're just going to be, dragging them, kicking and screaming. You're just gonna set yourself up for a great amount of stress and unpleasantness. Never take students who don't want your instruction. That's why I would never have children. That's just more difficult. If you want to go that route, good luck to you. I don't really get this question. Something about hardline Buddhist approach. I don't understand how that's true. I mean, I like actually the question. The Buddha said, wouldn't the Buddha, you said, wouldn't the Buddha consider simple things like starvation to be a case of mental illness? Well, I'm not quite sure what you're saying, but if you're saying intentional starvation, because people starve unintentionally, that's not mental illness. But intentionally starving yourself, is that a mental illness? Yeah. Just like any wrong practice is some kind of mental illness. It's not a very terrible one. I mean, there are worse mental illnesses. Or you might say that starving yourself purposefully is caused by mental illness, and by that we just mean delusion, really. The wrong idea that somehow starving yourself is going to have some positive effect. Otherwise, I don't quite get everything that you're trying to say. It seems that the mind is clinging to food and getting agitated for not getting it. If that's true, then that's also a mental illness. We had this question recently: how should I approach the strong attachments for family and friends towards myself? A similar question recently. Seems I can't continue without causing suffering for them. However, I don't know when I am mindful enough to reduce this suffering. So let's put it out there that strong attachments are the cause of suffering. It's their fault. They put themselves in this position by their strong attachment. It's not to criticize them for it or even abandon them because of it, but let's call a spade a spade. That's the truth. We willingly put ourselves in a position, setting ourselves up for great suffering. We know that intellectually that everyone we love is going to die, but we try to turn a blind eye and nonetheless cultivate such strong attachments that we do suffer, not just when they die, but when they change. So you have probably changed through practicing meditation, and I assume that's what you're talking about. You don't actually say, but if that's what you're talking about, then yeah, change is stressful for people who are attached to things that they think are stable. They have an image of you, and they have some pleasant memories of that image of you. Oh, when you were this way, I had so much pleasure from... Well, they don't talk like that, but that's really what they're saying. It's really the gist of it. Pleasure arose in my mind when you were this way, and now you're that way, and that pleasure no longer can arise because you no longer do X, Y, or Z. That's what I got when I started meditating. Very upset family, friends. well, unimpressed. But I mean, that's attachment. That the problem, and I've said this before, is that the people that we come into this life with, when we're unmindful, our reasons for being close to them have very little to do with things like meditation. So it's no wonder that that should all collapse. We can't meditate and then say, okay, now I'll go back and all my friends will love me for it. Well, not if your life before was totally on a different path. I can only think of a couple of people who I grew up with, there's a few people who I grew up with who are actually interested in the sorts of things that I do. But for the most part, they're not people who I was actually close with. People on the periphery, or people who maybe I kind of dismissed because they were goody-goodies, or that sort of thing, you know. So it's kind of funny how back then being a goody-goody was a bad thing. Being a good person was uncool, something to be derided. I could, if I thought a lot about it, I could probably find people who I was not nice to when I was younger, who at this point I would think they were so much better than me. Anyway, yeah, so the point being that you're not going to fix it, not necessarily. Everyone has to lose everything that is dear to them. And your job is not to make people feel good about their attachments. I mean, not that you should make them feel bad intentionally, but it can't be the answer. That being said, you of course want to help people. It doesn't help anyone if you just cut people off and make them very, very angry at you. So the only answer I really have for you that's probably useful is take it slowly, take it easy. But keep clear in your mind that it's not wrong. People don't suffer because you stop feeding their addictions. They suffer because they're addicted. They have the addiction in the first place. So like any addict, you slowly wean them off to drugs. I mean, it's all, in the end, it's all chemicals in our brain that give us pleasure. It's all drugs in the end. This question I maybe should just not really answer. Consciousness, some say consciousness leaves the body when it dies. So consciousness being the root of everything, really. It's not that the consciousness leaves the body, it's that the body dies and is no longer like the thing that the mind clung to, so the mind abandons it. The mind rejects it because the body is no longer familiar. I mean, it happens during accidents, during near-death experiences, because the body again shuts down, stops being familiar, and so there's a jolt and the mind is jolted out of it. It happens in out-of-body experiences when you get into states where you're disconnected from the body and the mind is able to jolt out of it and that sort of thing. But consciousness difference between alive and non-alive, if you're talking about physically, no, the consciousness stays the same, doesn't matter what happens to the body, basically. Oh, and here we have new questions. Oh, we have a bunch of new questions. 8 new questions. Well, that's not really fair. I think I'm going to put these aside because there were 13 or 14 when I started. So these ones are going to wait until next week because it gives a chance for people to, I don't know, to rate them, I guess. It gives me a chance to go over them, and some I will just delete, I'm sorry to say. So that's all for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in.